Government is broken. Now, you're probably thinking, how broken is it? It's so broken that last week in the LA Times, they described the current Congress as the most do-nothing Congress in recent history. It's so broken that nothing can get done. And in fact, Republicans and Democrats can't even agree over it's broken. But one thing they can agree on, if it is, they know whose fault it is, and that's the other side. Not surprisingly, pundits disagree. You could say that about virtually any topic. Some say that it's not broken. Republicans and Democrats have never gotten along, and this do-nothing Congress is really nothing different. Others say it's not broken. After all, no one should cooperate with that expletive-deleted other side, and it's working just the way it should. But the American public knows broken when they see it. Recent polls show historic negativity toward the US government, higher than any other time, I want to say in history, but some historian's going to jump up and tell me that's not quite right. Let's say in the history of poll taking. It is, in fact, trust and confidence in the US government and Congress is at an all-time low. It's not just partisanship, it's hyper-partisanship. And in fact, we're able to get nothing done in order to help our country move ahead. There's really a toxic political atmosphere in Washington. In psychology, we use as evidence that racism is decreasing the fact that it's no longer socially acceptable to make overtly racist statements. Well, by analogy, we could conclude that hyperpartisanship is increasing because it is now socially acceptable to say out loud and in public that I hope the President of the United States fails. And we use that as evidence that things are increasingly negative. There are record levels of negativity. I'm starting with the premise that Congress is broken and that we have a problem, and that you are as fed up as I am. Raise your hand if you agree. Okay, anyone who doesn't raise their hand, you're immediately ostracized. I want every hand up here. I want to know you're with me on this. That we have record levels. And in fact, I'm not a political scientist. I'm a cognitive psychologist. So I'm viewing this problem from the lens of psychological science, and I'm using what we know about psychological science to suggest corrective actions that you and I can take to fix at least a little bit what is a broken Congress. Moderates can no longer survive in Congress. This has not always been true. Ezra Klein, writing in the Washington Post, said, 70s, 80s, well into the 90s, there were always Democrats that were more conservative than the most moderate Republicans. That is no longer true. And of course, the reverse was true. Moderates can no longer get elected, and even if they could, moderates wouldn't choose to work in such a hostile environment where it's absolutely impossible to work together. Mention climate change, and the Republicans will play it for laughs. It's not climate science, it's political science. Mention entitlement programs, and the Democrats suddenly have to tie their shoes. As partisanship has become more polarized, we have political gridlock, and the result has been absolutely nothing has been done. We need to understand why the left and the right view the world so differently. We need to understand that, in fact, they have different worldviews, different beliefs, and in fact are culturally very different. But we know from past and from many instances in history that people with diverse political perspectives, people from different cultural backgrounds can come together for a common good when that's in fact what we want them to do. I'm quoting now, almost quoting, from Professor Schwarzenegger. I kid you not. He is now a professor. This week they opened the institute at USC designed to encourage bipartisanship. And he has said that he's found that, in fact, good outcomes can happen when people come together, listen respectfully, and work for a common good. You know, I sort of miss having him as my governor. I love saying to people out of state that my governor could beat up their governor, but there was always someone from Minnesota who was willing to take me on. So maybe, maybe that wasn't right. I'm going to suggest 7 things that you and I can do to fix at least a little bit a broken Congress. None of these things are easy, but they're things that we have to do if we want to see the kind of change that I think we want. One of the first things we have to do is to change the rules of the game. Politicians are playing a serious game, and the outcomes have important consequences. If, in fact, anyone gets anything done, the other side is going to be a big loser. So if, for example, unemployment is reduced, the economy is increased, that then is a positive for Obama, and he is much more likely to see a second term. But if the Republicans can successfully block any sort of initiative that might have a positive outcome for economy, for unemployment, for any of the things that we care about, then in fact it's a win for them. And then they're more likely to be the next term president. This is a classic zero-sum game. I win, you lose, and vice versa. We have a large research literature on zero-sum games. One thing you and I can do is we can change the rules of this game. We, in fact, can tell our politicians every time there is a debate, every time a news reporter talks to a politician, we ask them to say, what have you done to cooperate with the other side for the common good? And we keep a score of cooperation so that, in fact, this is modern social media. You can get hundreds of thousands, even more, hits on a well-done YouTube, on tweeting lots of friends and friends. And suppose we ask them to respond repeatedly. What have they done to cooperate to get something done for the common good? We can give them points. Now, there are already lots of organizations that keep meticulous count of everything that happens in Congress. Tell them you want them to keep count of how often people have compromised. We can change the rules of the game if we work together. In psychology, we say, if we care about something, we measure it. And boy, we measure everything. Well, if we care about it and start measuring it, this is a way of, in fact, giving the message that we care about getting things done and that we care about cooperation. One of the reasons for this extreme rhetoric is a ubiquitous sort of bias that we all have. It's called my side bias. My side is morally right. My side is filled with saintly public servants. Your side? Villains. Villains, how villainous? They beat puppies to death with baby seals. That was the best I could come up with. These are really bad actors. Well, it turns out that this is a ubiquitous sort of bias we have, but there are things we can do about it. It's the unshakable conviction that one's belief system and that of other in-group members is always right and righteous, and that others' beliefs are always wrong and wrong-headed. This is an extremely strong bias. But let me tell you a story about this bias. I was recently talking with someone who is now a prominent psychologist. But in the past, he was a white police officer in South Africa under apartheid. And I wanted to try to understand, how does he now think about his participation in what I think is undeniably a dark period in history? I'm not sure how I asked the question, but he must have been asked this question before. And he said to me, Diane, you need to understand that from a very early age on, as far back as I can remember, I was told that our side was right. We were just. It was the meddling outsiders that were trying to change a just world to an unjust world. He no longer believes that that is true. He had a strongly entrenched my side bias starting in infancy, but we can overcome it. Here are some ways we can overcome it. First, think about where you get your information. Not surprisingly, you get information from sources that you trust. If you are politically conservative, it's a good bet that you watch Fox News. If you watch Fox News, then you're going to hear information that's consistent with your belief system. And you're going to be reassured that those blundering dunderheads on the other side got it all wrong. And in fact, you are right. And in fact, what that does is it continues to concretize, turn into concrete, your belief system. But there is something we can do to counteract calcification of the brain. Listen to other sources. Deliberately listen to Al Jazeera, to BBC News, even, I shudder to suggest for those of you who are conservative, The Daily Show. Yes, it is going to be painful to hear people talk about things that you do not agree with. But there's no way you can understand the perspective and thinking of the other side if you're not willing to think thoughtfully, listen to it. So I'm asking of you the same thing I'm asking of our politicians, and that is to listen to other perspectives. Now, you just might find something that you can agree with, some kind of common ground that in fact can turn around my side bias. This is a related bias, is confirmation bias. And here we have two cartoon characters. Hey, Mom, who's more open-minded, liberals or conservatives? Most people are already open-minded about ideas they agree with. I think that's pretty good conversation from two paper-thin cartoon characters, because in fact, we are always open-minded. We rate similar kinds of information when it agrees with our perspective as being far more persuasive than if it were identical and agreed with another perspective. We remember instances where, in fact, it supports our point of view. But we can do things to make ourselves a little more open-minded. Not so open-minded that your brains fall out, but open-minded enough that you're able to see perhaps some common ground. And if not common ground, find other ways to make compromise. As it is now, since we'd like to listen to a particular point of view, many people consider an unwavering support for a single conclusion to be a virtue. And any politician, anyone who changes his position on something, is going to have a very cheap brand of shoes named after them, the flip-flopper. But I am suggesting that instead, if we listen to the reason for the change, if it's based on new evidence, if it's based on a new kind of understanding, we create a new kind of shoe. Not attractive, it's the best I could do. One standing on the evidence. And in fact, we say that changing one's perspective is not bad if in fact it incorporates new evidence. Of course, you still need to be careful that they haven't changed just for political expediency. There's no substitute for knowledge about what's going on. Listen to the level of distortion when politicians present the opposing point of view. How can we get them to understand and honestly portray the opposition? Well, I have a suggestion. Every debate, every time they talk to a reporter, in fact, they're asked to paraphrase what the other side has just said. That is, put it in their own words. In a debate, the other side would have a chance to, in fact, make those corrections, if there's corrections, so that they actually have to say back in an honest way what they have heard. Then borrowing here from a technique that's sometimes used in family therapy when husbands, wives, and children don't listen to each other because they only hear what they expect to hear. But look, if Congress is acting like a dysfunctional family, then certainly we can treat it that way. And this is a way of, in fact, bringing people so that they can find perhaps some common agreement, some common ground, some way that they can actually be honest in their portrayal of each other. There will still be disagreements. We're going to disagree over how well a politician presented someone else's point of view. We're going to disagree over how well someone has cooperated with the other side. But the difference here is we have changed the nature of the discourse. And now we are disagreeing over how well they've compromised instead of how well they have not compromised. We need to rethink groupthink. Groupthink is that requirement that everyone toe the party line. And in fact, most politicians vote virtually always along the party lines. What that means is nobody needs to be thinking. After all, if I already know what my party is, I need never think about the issue. What we need to do is reward the naysayer in the group, reward someone who goes beyond and actually stands out and goes against their party, whether or not you agree with that position, because it shows a sense of thinking and perhaps reflects a sense of their morality. This is important. This idea came from studies by psychologists who studied the Bay of Pigs decision under President Kennedy. And in order to maintain group cohesiveness, they would not listen to alternative choices of action, to anyone who said anything that was opposed to the main plan. We know that if we put a devil's advocate in every group, if we encourage naysaying, we get better decisions than if we don't. Okay, show us who pays the bills. You know the difference between a racetrack driver and a politician? Difference is the racetrack driver shows you who's paying the bills. He has the labels on his hat, on his sleeve, and over his heart. Now just suppose we required the same of our politicians. Just suppose that would you listen differently if a politician's telling you about what he thinks about school reform when he's wearing a large label from a teachers union? Or perhaps when a politician says alternative forms of energy are never going to be cost effective when he has a great big decal on from the oil company. We need to understand who pays the bills if we're going, and we need to wear them. Oh, I will never make it in the fashion industry. But clearly, this is what we need to do. What I'm actually asking is that you use principles of critical thinking. I've written about critical thinking for decades. I've taught critical thinking for decades. And you know, all these decades, I have always had the same sort of quip. And that was, I've never known anyone who took the con position, the position that's opposed to critical thinking. That is, until now. Here is the Texas GOP platform for 2012, and it is a quote: "We oppose the teaching of critical thinking, which focuses on challenging students' fixed beliefs and undermining parental authority." So let me get this right. The official platform is that children should never challenge the beliefs of their parents. Okay, that sounds like not thinking to me rather than critical thinking. And you might guess, you can just guess, that Jon Stewart did a hilarious parody on this. He said that he too believed that his children should always think as he did, but then reality set in when they turned 3, and he realized it wasn't going to work. If, in fact, we never thought differently from our parents, we'd still have slavery. At least the white kids would. We'd still be a British colony. If we never questioned the thinking of those who came before us. To their credit, sort of, the GOP, Texas GOP, said this was a mistake. And in fact, the problem is they can't rescind it because they've written it and they voted on it and it's become their official policy. I am wondering, how does one write this, vote on it, and post it by accident? I can only guess that someone wasn't thinking. So what I have for you is 7 things I want you to do if you want to change the system. Change the rules of the game. We can elect leaders who, in fact, will think and will represent all of us from diverse perspective and diverse views. And we can do it if we work together. Here's where you can reach me if, in fact, you want to join with me and start our own political revolution where we're going to make Congress work together. Thank you very much.